Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's session on charting your D&I progress. We'll plan to tackle questions such as how do you measure your organization's D&I progress, and what metrics should be used to evaluate your organizational performance. As many of you know, today's event is part of BAB's STIR series, which is a series discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion against a backdrop of US and UK business. It's a series built in partnership with our members to address these cross-cutting issues regardless of sector, geography, or company size. The STIR has really become a central program line for British American business, and that is thanks in large part to our sponsors, who I'm going to name check right now. So we have ACCA, Broadridge, Chicago Booth School of Business, EY, National Grid, Siemens Financial Services, and Virgin Atlantic. Lots of great partners. Clearly, this is an important thread of programming for our members. And also a very big thanks to today's content partner, a long-standing member of British American Business, YSC Consulting. And to take us through today's session, discussion, and workshop, it's my pleasure to introduce Gregory Fernandez, Director and Head of DE&I Americas at YSC Consulting. With over 10 years of experience, Greg designs and implements DE&I and talent strategies and is passionate about bringing inclusive leadership to all of his work. Greg holds a master's and a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, and his work on designing holistic development programs for underrepresented talent leverages his experience in psychology, human behavior, DE&I, and organizational change. Greg, we could have not asked for a better person to lead us through today's session. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Tamara, and what a fantastic opening. And thank you so much for inviting us to be here as a part of this discussion today around charting your DEI progress. And we're excited to hear a little bit more from our panelists in a few minutes. But just in terms of today's format, we've got two portions to our discussion today. So in a couple minutes, we'll begin with a panel discussion where we'll get a chance to hear from a couple of panelists around how they've been charting their progress in their organization's DE&I efforts. The second portion of today's session is a workshop, and it's an interactive workshop. So it's really an opportunity for you to take some of the content that you may be hearing in the panel discussion, start to discuss that in small breakout groups, and then also hear a little bit about how you can start to drive your own individual sustainable change around diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organizations. I have a couple colleagues from my team at YSC Consulting who will be joining us to support in those breakout groups when we get to that portion of the discussion today. In terms of our ground rules for today's session, there are just a couple of things that I wanted to cover. As we move throughout the panel discussion, if you have questions that you'd like to address to the panel, please feel free to drop those into the chat. We'll be taking a look at that chat throughout today's session, and we'll do our best to integrate some of those questions into the discussion today. The session today is being recorded, and we will make sure that you have access to a link for that recording after today's session as well. The last ground rule is just that we ask that if you're not speaking, that you please keep your microphones on mute. Please feel free to turn your cameras on. It's great to be able to see everyone. And when we move into the breakout groups, there'll be more of an opportunity for you to unmute and discuss in smaller groups. So with all that being said, why don't we move right into the panel discussion? I'll give our two panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So Dave, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to you, Patrice.
Good morning, Greg, and thank you for having me. So my name is Dave Ramnarayan. I am a partner at Trodham Advisory Services and also Executive Vice President for the National Association of Black Accountants, better known as NABA, and have dedicated, a big part of my time in the last couple of years in and around DEI initiatives as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. And Patrice?
Good morning, my name. Oh, Patrice or Catrice? I'm sorry.
Patrice.
Go ahead, sorry.
Hi everyone, I'm Patrice from Virgin Atlantic. Unfortunately, Estelle Hollingsworth, who's our Chief HR Officer, couldn't make it today, so she's asked me to attend. I have been with Virgin Atlantic for about 5 years now, and I'm also a fellow accountant as well, Dave. And I kind of pride myself as a leader who focuses quite heavily on diversity and inclusion, so try to sew it as a single thread throughout everything I do. And I'm involved quite heavily in some of the organisational commitments, as well as just about publishing my own very book on reverse mentoring and using it as a tool to build more inclusive workplaces. So got a lot of experience in this area from listening to lots of organisations who are going through this journey as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for joining us today. We'll have a few questions that we'll ask. And as I shared earlier, if there's additional questions that our audience would like to ask, please feel free to drop those into the chat. I actually wanted to start with getting a little bit more personal for a moment, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you all have been doing in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, I know this is a space that a lot of people are attracted to, but I'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you around what drew you into getting involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. How did you get started in this space?
You'd like me to,
Dave, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, I mean, it's a little bit interesting. So what got me started in this space, like most of us, you know, who are in this space, it stems from, you know, experience or personal experiences. You know, the first for me, I was, you know, young in my accountant career, and I'm standing in my manager's office, really disappointed, you know, asking about why I didn't get promoted. And, you know, what my manager had to share with me was very concerning at the time, and it was really frustrating. Basically, I was getting promoted pretty quickly in my career, and at some point I became a senior, and then I was up for promotion again, and I was usually promoted out of time. So if they said 1 year to get promoted, I might have gotten promoted in 9 months or 6 months, as the case might be. And once I got to the senior level and my file came up for promotion again, we at the time had pretty much all the decision makers were white, and the comment that was made, where does this brown boy think he's going so fast? And for me, like hearing that, I couldn't believe that that was still a conversation. This was, you know, 15, 16 years ago. The second thing for me is when I became a manager, I then had accountability for several staff members. And in my reviews, one of my responsibility was to put forward, you know, argument or case for promotion and or increases. And I would see that I would make the exact argument for increases for both my female mentees and my male mentees. And more often than not, and I could say close to 100% of the time, when the results came back, I would see that my male counterparts, my male mentees were getting higher salary increases than the female mentees that I had. Or in some cases, the female mentees got promoted, but the salary increase of the male was higher than the promoted female staff member. So, you know, like seeing those things for me early in my career sort of put a little bit of fire under me to say that I don't think this is right. And how can I make a difference in this space by bringing light to some of these conversations? And there's lots more stories like that, but those were two of the ones that I wanted to share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave. Patrice, how about for you? What drew you into this space?
I think I've always been the unintended spokesperson in the organisations I join. So not from an ethnicity perspective, but definitely from I rose, similar stories to Dave, I rose quite quickly early on in my career. So I had the unique benefit of being able to understand people on the ground, so to speak, the frontline staff, as well as the seniors that I conversed with around the leadership team table. And being able to play in those two spaces afforded me a voice. And I often was called on to kind of use my voice on both ends of that spectrum. Fast forward kind of probably about 5 or 6 years ago when I'd moved across different businesses and I was in senior roles, and I was often the only Black female in the room. it weighed heavily on me, and I really had to think about, actually, do I always want to be the only Black female in the room? No. So what do I need to do? How can I use my voice? As I became more senior, I became a bit more confident in using my voice. Less fear of repercussion, so to speak, but more confident that I could understand and I could really make a difference. I felt a huge responsibility on myself, especially looking back and looking at how I can bring people up the ladder. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to make sure that I'm not the only, and that we can collectively remove barriers for people who are underrepresented in the workforce. So that's really my big driver. And I've learned to be in surroundings and organizations which fuel that. So it helps me to be in flow. And it really helps to just kind of drive the agenda and move things forward.
Yeah, and thank you both for sharing. I think you've already started to touch on our core topic for today, which is how we can chart our progress around diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from each of you about what progress you've seen in the organizations that you work with and how you've been able to track that progress. Patrice, do you want to go first? And then Dave, we can come back around to you.
I think when we had kind of had a pre-meet, we talked specifically over the past 2 years. And I know that some of that work has paused, and it's probably very similar to everybody on this call in terms of the progress that was being made and then slightly paused, but then maybe a catalyst happened in 2020 to help push things forward a little bit more too. Prior to 2020, Virgin Atlantic has been on a journey, and part of that is around something called Be Yourself. And through that, we encourage all our employees to be yourself and bring your whole self to work. We lean really heavily on our ERGs. So we've got a disability network, an ethnicity network, an LGBTQ+ network, and a women's network as well. So they form a large part of the basis behind that strategy. We also have kind of Passport for Change, which is looking at how do we make systemic change within society and looking at kind of routes into the airline industry. So really trying to go on to early years and think about how we can impact there. So I would say we have been making progress, but it's been really slow. And I think given we have had a couple of recapitalizations over the past 2 years during the pandemic, and that has meant we've lost almost half of our workforce. So actually, when we look at numbers, we look at the way that things lie at the moment, it's really difficult to kind of chart that and move that forward. I think we probably have similar challenges as many people on this call have in terms of that recruitment piece, the promotion piece, and making sure that the talent that we have, we are nurturing and pushing that talent forward. So there are a number of initiatives, and I think now we are coming out of the end of the pandemic as it was in its worst state. I'm really optimistic about kind of the next steps and what we do. In regards to data and charting the progress, I'm sure this is some challenge that everyone has. Also, we actually went through that exercise of kind of really trying to understand our baseline a few years ago, so ahead of the pandemic, to make sure we had a really firm baseline. And that was a really, I think, challenging exercise, but actually the level of self-disclosure was really high. And that really indicated to us as an organisation that there was a high level of trust. We do have an organisation where there is a high level of trust. And happiness, which is what we measure. So we had our recent happiness score, and obviously it's been challenging throughout the pandemic, but there is definitely that level of trust with the organisation and trust in the leaders to do the right thing and make the right decisions.
I think I echo something you shared there, Patrice, which is the slowness in which we've been seeing results, and that's been consistent. And in particular, one of the challenges in terms of measuring movement with the organization that I interact with, whether it be via NABA or some of my personal work that I do on the side as well, has been that in the US here, a lot of organizations in the last 2 years sort of jumped at the opportunity to say, oh, we're in the conversation. But then it was a PR thing. They put out a press release and then there was no follow through. So the struggle has been like, we got initial engagement, like, just a number, we had 100 companies come and say, oh, we want to have this conversation. And then the measurement beyond that, it just took a dive. because the publicity part of it was gone, and then in terms of implementing, that has now taken a really slow progress. And it looked like committees getting set up, but then the progress of meetings weren't tracked. The follow-up actions for getting involved in community events or whatever weren't tracked. So it became a little bit difficult to start tracking that progress. And so what we did is to try to shift the conversation and say, let's deal with it from an education standpoint. So that's where we pivoted, and I have pivoted to say, let's talk about the education part, because it seems like when we get into the measuring of a metric, when there isn't the underlying commitment, it's difficult.
I have to agree with you there, Dave. Following on from a lot of the research that I've done for my book and speaking to lots of businesses, year one is really after the furrow and the commitment. It's like, right, okay, we need to start somewhere, we need to baseline, and that includes numbers and it includes education. So it's really making sure that everyone in the organization is super clear, most importantly, the leaders.
Yes.
What does this commitment really mean? And what do we need? Where do we want to go? What is the North Star in terms of where we could go, and how far are we willing to go? Because I think everyone thinks, oh my God, we need to get to X. But when it comes to the commitment and the action behind it, actually they find that much more challenging and difficult. So I think that educational piece of really understanding where you sit on that continuum and what the appetite is to change, and being really honest with yourselves as a leadership team in regards to how far do you really want to go, is that essential step in that first year. And then when you speak to your people and your teams, then the message is a lot clearer and a lot more understandable, because actually you've gone through that whole process yourself.
Yeah, and I've had a funny conversation with an organization and the entire executive team, and one of the very senior people in that room just basically said, you know what, I think we should sit this one out and let somebody else figure it out, and then we'll adopt it at the end. So, having those frank conversation with leadership, it really have you get, where people are at on that continuum, like you're mentioning.
And I think just to follow on from that point, in regards to really just being clear in terms of, I think people of colour and people who are underrepresented can sniff out inauthenticity pretty well. So when it comes to your programs and what you're pushing forward, I always recommend it's best for you to be clear and true to yourself as an organisation and a leadership team before you actually start this piece of work, because actually what you run the risk of is causing more mistrust and probably making things slightly worse if you're being disingenuous and not being authentic in yourselves, than trying to just pause and wait and make sure that you're completely happy before moving step by step, because actually you'll lose more people on the way if they can tell you're not being authentic.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Patrice, and both of you brought up really interesting points around defining what that North Star is, understanding what it is that we're trying to do within our organization in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And secondly, understanding that there are three components to that. Part of that is about diversity. Part of that is about what is the organizational representation of the range of human differences in our organization. But then part of it's also about inclusion, which is a little bit different. It's about our culture. It's about, what's the feeling within our organization around feeling like we belong. And then thirdly, equity, which is even a step further to say, what are we doing as an organization, not only to drive change on an individual basis through individual leadership behaviors, but also thinking systemically about how we can drive change in this space. I think that builds nicely into another question I wanted to ask you all, which is, Patrice, you brought up a little bit of this already. What, from your experience, do you think organizations can do to accelerate their progress around their DEI goals?
It has to start with leadership. So it has to start with leadership and that commitment and that deep education. I think we're probably all on the same page that the unconscious bias, light touch training programs are not effective anymore. Were they ever effective? But I think now it's probably just come to light even more that they're not effective. So really getting the leaders to go through some kind of deep learning to make sure they're really clear about their unconscious biases, but really trying to bring that to the surface and say, actually, looking around this leadership team table, looking at the level below, whilst we might not say it, what biases clearly exist because of the makeup of these teams, and what do we need to do to be brave and intentionally and constructively look at how we feed the talent within our organization. And I specifically focus on feeding the talent within the organization, because I believe that lots of organizations have great talent which just need to be nurtured and taken care of, because I think the default is we need to obviously bring more in at the top. We need to build the pipeline and bring more people in. But then that goes to your point, Gregory, about the inclusion part. So how included do people of difference feel within these organizations, and is their talent being nurtured as much as it could do? So I think it's that inward look. Obviously look for best practice externally, but often if you ask the right questions and you look at some of the facts that exist, it's not too difficult to understand where some of the barriers are.
Definitely agree with that, Patrice, especially, talking about unconscious bias training becoming ineffective. One of the greatest ways I see that we can accelerate, and you'll probably guess this now, I'm passionate about education. So it's one of our greatest assets. However, the context behind how we are educated holds our power and freedom to create. So, where unconscious bias is concerned, these two words have become very, used very often in so many different contexts over the last 2 years. The manner in which unconscious bias has been talked about in the last 2 years have left people with an experience of fear to talk about it, in survival mode, in some cases just losing your self-expression because you don't know what to say or how you would sound, how to act. And in some cases, some of my counterparts who are not people of color, fear they might say the wrong thing every time they come up in a conversation. So here, what I'm saying is that context is powerful. What we've been, what I've been advocating for is, let's stop the demonization of unconscious bias, which is what I say. Unconscious bias, it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. As a human being, and the way that our brain is made up, our survival nature, our brain is wanted to be more efficient, so we create habits and patterns and all of that stuff. Unconscious bias, we could say that as a human being, we are an unconscious bias creating machine because it happened based on our surroundings. From when we are little growing up, we create all of these biases. Now, what become very big in the last 2 years is the social context of that. But we have it around food, around culture, around the people we associate with, who we hang out with. But we don't really talk about it in the same light. So what I think that would accelerate this is to acknowledge that unconscious bias is a human phenomenon, and that it will be powerful when we are comfortable interacting with unconscious bias, leaning into it, not as that thing out there, but as a part of who we are as human being. The moment you recognize that, then suddenly you get a little bit more freedom, a little bit more ease to interact with the conversation of unconscious bias.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point, Dave. And what I love hearing from the two of you is almost two sides of the equation. Dave, what you're talking about is on an individual level, what can we do as individuals to drive sustainable change around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And it starts with challenging ourselves not only to recognize our unconscious biases, but also to take action to create spaces of greater inclusion for the people around us. And Patrice, what I'm hearing from you as well is it's not only about the individual effort, it's also about the systemic effort of what we're doing more broadly in our organizations to create those conditions for change. What are some of the sort of the higher level actions that we can take? We have just a couple minutes left in our panel discussion before we move into the workshop. So I have one last question that I wanted to ask you both. And that is, if you could give one piece of advice to our audience here today around what they can do to chart their organization's progress around diversity, equity, and inclusion, what would that advice be?
I could go, I'd have one sentence, which is stay curiously engaged. That's it. You know, it would keep you in a frame of mind that would always have you asking the question and really being engaged with everyone around you. So stay curiously engaged.
I really like that. To build on that, I would say employ the growth mindset. So I think all of you organizations will have sales targets, efficiency targets that you're trying to beat. And when, you know, the psychology of selling is something that everybody looks into. But if we think of the psychology of equity, diversity, and inclusion, this is a very big question. However, if you employ that growth mindset and really think to yourselves and challenge yourselves on a day-to-day basis as to, is this acceptable? Can I be better? Can I try harder? Can I make myself a little bit more uncomfortable in this so that I can drive bigger and better results, is something that I would definitely recommend.
Yeah, I think these are great points, and I love the thread there of growth mindset, of staying curiously engaged, of really digging in. And sometimes it's tough to look into our organizations and see the challenges that might exist. But I think what comes from that is the opportunity to better define what's going to drive success and what's going to drive change in this organization, in the context that we're in, given the unique challenges that we might have. So that's almost the advice that I would give, is to say, be clear, understand your context, understand what's going to work for you, and understand that, you know, it's not a one size fits all sort of area. We have to really define what are the goals that we're going to focus on in this organization, and then get clear about what are the right actions and activities that are going to drive that impact.
Can I share one last thing quickly? Because the word context came up a couple of times in my sharing, and I've heard from yourself and Patrice. And there's one little thing that I always do when I'm stuck in a context, and like this, you know, I always say, okay, what is this in the context of anatomy? Like, context is decisive, so it's decisive that this is a finger in anatomy. In numerology, it's decisive this is one. In direction, it's decisive that this is up. This didn't change. I just had 3 legitimate contexts, and each of them, it was decisive in that context. So, you know, that's what it was, but this didn't change. So sometimes all there is a shift in context. You know, your boss isn't going to get better, the leadership might not change, but how can we shift our context in the way we interact with something to produce a different result?
Yeah, and how do we understand all of those different potential contexts as well? And I think that's some of the challenge in this space when we're trying to drive both individual and systemic changes, understanding all of the different lenses and all of the different perspectives around what's happening in our organizations and what that means for what we can do to drive change in this space.
I was just going to add that you've got the individual, we obviously have the organization, but we have the collective, which is the guys, everyone who's on the phone today. And I think throughout, definitely throughout the pandemic, it's been very evident that collaboration is key to survival in all senses. So it might be industry, or it might be British American business, or think about the groups that you belong to, your organization belongs to as well, because actually the power of that collaboration will actually drive much more systemic change than you alone will drive. And that's something I'm particularly interested in, especially when it comes to reverse mentoring, how you use that as a tool, but use it across different industries and people finding different ways to employ it to drive that real change that you need. So definitely about collaboration. So I'm looking forward to jumping in one of these rooms to hear what everybody's doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to move into the breakout rooms here and move into the interactive workshop portion in a moment. This is really a continuation of the conversation that we've been having with the panelists, and we'll invite the panelists back at the end of today's session for some additional closing thoughts. But Dave, Patrice, thank you for your thoughts already. And in a couple moments here, we're going to move into breakout groups. You'll be seeing a couple of my colleagues from YSC Consulting who will be joining you to continue the conversation in this space. So we'll see you in just a moment. All right, it looks like we have most of the group returning now. So I just wanted to invite our panelists. Were there any closing thoughts, Dave and Patrice, that you wanted to share with the group?
Hi, from the breakout session, I just got to say that I see that there's a lot of commitment around, and my closing thought is, don't forget to acknowledge yourself for the work and the commitment that you're bringing to the table, because a lot of times we forget that and we're doing what we're doing, but pause and even request that acknowledgement. It goes a long way. And if it is we operate as fully acknowledged human beings, it makes the effort that we're putting out there even greater.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's so powerful. We often talk about this with our clients as extending grace to ourselves and extending curiosity to ourselves, while still saying we're going to challenge ourselves to step out of our comfort zones. But this work is a journey, and it's a continuous, never-ending journey as well.
Yeah. I think we might be missing, one group, are we?
I don't know if we're missing a group, but I know that Patrice was having some technical issues.
Okay.
I know we're coming right up to time, so I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us today for this discussion, and thank you in particular to Dave and Patrice for providing your thoughts in the panel discussion. And thank you for such an engaging conversation. It was really interesting to hear some of the talk in the breakout room that I was a part of. So I'm excited to see what you all are able to do to continue to chart your organization's progress in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Tamara, I think you have a couple thoughts to close us out as well.
Yeah, first thought is just a thank you. So Greg, thank you so much for kind of steering us through today's session. Dave, thank you. Thanks to Patrice. I know she's trying to rejoin. She was having a tech issue. Thanks to all of you for joining. We've just skimmed the surface, and Greg, I think you mentioned that you would be happy to share this sort of leadership self-assessment tool. And so we'll send that around to everyone who joined, because I think that really is the next sort of practical, tangible step in kind of moving this conversation and this initiative forward. So again, thanks everyone for joining. Please do join us for our International Women's Day event. It's going to be on Wednesday, March 9th. The theme is on women's wellness. Invitation just went out today. If you didn't receive it, please be in touch and we'll get you the information. So thanks everyone and have a good one.